This is Sleeping in Trees, the audiobook, Chapter 40, Going Up? The regatta was in Copenhagen, Denmark. Just like the years before, we had to gather boats, sailing gear, and suitcases, plus a few random relatives, and board an ocean liner set to sail out across the Atlantic. Destination? Lisbon. I docked there twice, once sailing on the HMS Santa Maria, and another time on the TSS Olympia. The TSS Olympia was a Greek ship. The captain was Greek. The crew was Greek. All the Greek food was prepared by Greeks. Over the entire 2-week voyage, the Greek service and total experience was Greek, which was to say, just superb. Mom and Dad constantly raved. The stewards, the food, the attentive and polite service at every turn. My mother before long was taken to exclaiming, "I'm going Greek." My dad would grimace, and any staff in earshot would clasp their hands, avert their gaze, and smile demurely. My youngest brother had arrived on the scene to the surprise but delight of many, including my parents, a few years before the trip. Being old enough to toddle around, he embarked right along with the rest of the Brown Brigade. He was number 9 in the lineup of 9. Depending on one's view, he was either in a tough spot or a good spot the day he was born at South Miami Hospital. 6 years younger than me and the last in the 4-boy lineup, he would likely be operating on his own without much of a sibling connection, and doted on by a mother and father who celebrated him almost as an only child. At 9 years of age, I was on the move and had little interest in coddling a baby brother. Let's just say that the things I possessed and activities I was engaged in were not consistent with those of a newborn. In slinkies, building blocks, and stuffed toys, I had little interest. The small tyke slid quite comfortably into the position of only child. Often reminded by my mother that the world was his oyster, it was apparent that he soon began to believe it. Increasingly, he wanted more from those around him and was willing to tolerate less and less. As he grew, so did his self-importance and sense of entitlement. In adolescence, he became enamored with tennis. He was smallish in stature, so with football, rugby, and basketball out, the burgeoning sport of tennis seemed to fit the boy quite well. My parents had acquired a jumbo recreational vehicle about that time, and it was the ideal rolling locker room and training facility for a budding tennis phenom. With oil prices moderating following the '73 embargo, the recreational vehicle exploded grotesquely onto the scene. The ungainly beasts would roam up and down the interstates and back roads to the complete misery of those lowly members of the populace who only drove cars. Then, fatigued each afternoon from their motorized wanderings, the behemoths, like a herd of African wildebeests, would assemble in large gravel parking lots called RV campgrounds, plug in and power up with fat utility cables, and finally connect discreetly to the sanitary sewers. Soon, up would spring exterior aluminum awnings, and out would pop the sides of the vehicles to properly apportion the extended sleeping quarters inside. Next, a couple of cheap folding chairs will be pulled from the undercarriage storage bins, while tiny dogs sat on wide dashboards, peering out over their new domain for a day. The grills would be lit, the clinking of cocktails could be heard, and another day of America's newest form of roughing it would quietly draw to a close. Millions of Americans at that time also picked up the exciting game of tennis. Though around for over 100 years, for some reason its popularity exploded in the early 1970s, and the game arrived in a frenzy of yellow, fuzzy balls, bright green courts, and stylish polyester togs. The tennis darlings, Billie Jean King and Chris Evert, got the ball rolling, and then the brats, John McEnroe and Jimmy Connors, added the surly edge that TV needed to transform the refined and staid English sport into a crass and brash spectacular, spewing forth zillions of advertising dollars, all to the utter delight of prime-time New York City TV execs dressed in dark suits and sporting very wide ties. Tennis shops popped up everywhere, and enthusiasts, both young and very old, bopped around in coordinated tennis frocks and smocks. Bright green and blue courts sprouted like crabgrass all over South Florida, and the cocktail party chatter shifted from oil cartels and Watergate to gut strings versus nylon, moisture-ruined gut, wood versus composites versus aluminum, the Eastern versus the Western grip, racket presses, topspin, and tennis elbow. When off the tourney trail and local courts, my little brother tended to laze around the house in his tennis whites, doing his best to irritate his older brothers. With diligent practice, he soon excelled. About that time, he developed a penchant for Coca-Cola. He consumed 3 or 4 cans a day. On a good day, a 6-pack would slip coolly down his skinny little gullet. I used to wonder how he even functioned, much less held the oversized racket, much larger than even his blonde afro, with quarts of the sugary syrup coursing through his digestive system. My mother would bring several 6-packs of the red cans home every few days, and it would quickly disappear. It was not long before I discerned a pattern. A plentiful Coca-Cola supply would rapidly become no Coca-Cola at all. Yet a couple of hours later, the scrawny tennis bum would be sitting in the living room watching TV and sipping on a cold one. It just didn't add up. One Sunday afternoon, I quietly crept out to the laundry room and opened the spare refrigerator. Everyone in our neighborhood seemed to have one. It was the same refrigerator that had been acquired years before with great enthusiasm and heavy expense, that still worked perfectly, but had for some reason been relegated to backup duties in the utility room or garage. From the centerpiece of the home, it had been demoted. Its features had been outpaced, or perhaps its color was no longer in vogue. The upper shelf that normally held a few 6-packs of Coca-Cola was bare. I pondered the situation. The day before, I was certain that Mom had restocked. Something was amiss. I smelled a rat. I smelled my younger brother. Just ain't no way, I mumbled to myself. Not even he could have consumed a dozen cans of Coca-Cola in a single day. I reached down and slowly pulled open the produce drawer. Aha! There, tucked under a head of crisp iceberg lettuce, were 6 cans of frosty Coca-Cola. The conniving little creep had been pilfering most of the family supply for months. That afternoon, Ding created his new nickname, Mr. Horrible. Back on the TSS Olympia, it was 1 week into our journey abroad, and we were deep in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, some 12,000 feet above the pitch-black bottom. We had settled into daily routines of sleeping until noon, visiting the buffets, taking a bracing dip in the frigid saltwater pool, or taking in a movie. If one had to attend a regatta in Denmark, arriving at ease, relaxed and well-fed, yet with the competitive fires aflame, it was hard to argue with this form of transportation. There were few complaints. One morning my parents had an odd request. Sigrid, Mr. Horrible's Norwegian nanny, was not feeling well. Apparently, 30-foot open ocean swells were taking their toll. They asked me if I could be responsible enough to mind the tyke for a couple of hours. I had no idea what they had planned, but it did not include either one of us. Why, certainly, I could handle that, I assured them. After all, I had just turned 9. We were only motoring in the mid-Atlantic on a 600-foot, 22,000-ton ocean liner, cruising at 24 knots with 8 decks, 2 pools, and 4 restaurants through 30-foot seas against 25-knot headwinds, gusting on occasion to 40. The decks were completely unsecured and wide open with railings a toddler could wander right through, unencumbered. The winds were easily capable of launching that toddler, like a rag doll, right up and over the railing without a sound. Out on the deck, the roar was deafening. Only the bellowing blast of the massive ship's horn could break through. When asked again if I was sure, my response was the same. No problem. I could handle a 3-year-old. So off my parents went after the typical stern reminders. This is a big ship. The wind outside is blowing a gale. We are halfway between New York and Lisbon. Keep a close eye on your younger brother. Don't lose him. Diligence on my part was paramount. I was being trusted with the well-being of the only younger brother I had. In a moment, Mom and Dad were gone. And so was Mr. Horrible. Almost instantly, I had no idea where he was. It is amazing how quickly a 3-year-old can evaporate. Every parent has had that heart-stopping fright when the toddler who was just underfoot is suddenly no longer there. For a few minutes, I was not overly concerned. I'd spot him in a moment. After all, the two of us had been heading together to the small gift shop right up from our stateroom for some candy in the long empty hallway that led to the central mezzanine. He had to be right nearby. He was not. I did the perfunctory scans up and down the hallways in my sightline. I probed the openings of the shops and restaurant lobbies, and the telephone booth alcoves. I mean, how much yardage could someone with 1-foot legs possibly cover within a minute or two? The escalation from mild concern to irritation, to discomfort to serious alarm, to all-out panic did not take long. Within minutes, I had a small army comprised of the crew and restaurant staff racing about the TSS Olympia. Announcements in English, Spanish, Greek, and Italian were broadcast over the public address system every few minutes about a young American boy possibly lost at sea. I was terrified and soon careened into complete panic. At one point, I found the courage to rush up to the aft deck and all the way to the stern of the mighty ocean liner. In 40-knot gusts, I gripped the weathered teak railing, sick to my stomach as I peered out over the frothy wash made by the ship's massive brass propellers. I scanned the rapidly receding wake in fading afternoon light for any sign of color that might stand out against the turbulent, dark water 80 feet below. Anyone in this cold, rough sea without protection would last maybe 5 minutes before they succumbed to hypothermia and the 30-foot waves and sank to the frigid black bottom. I saw not a speck of anything that might indicate Mr. Horrible's presence. My parents were probably, at that moment, seated at the captain's private table, learning about the colorful life of a Greek seaman. As they nibbled on their confit and crusts of French bread and sipped expensive wines and 12-year-old scotch, little did they know that their 9-year-old son may have, within but a few minutes of their departure, lost their only toddler to a wicked and unforgiving Atlantic. Though a bit of a spoiled brat, the little guy did have his favorable qualities, and I had barely gotten to know him in the 3 short years he had bugged and harassed me. I was determined to find him and bring him safely home. Just as the level of panic could go no higher, and I was sinking into complete despair, the elevator doors opened into the mezzanine lobby, and out stepped a 24-inch tall elevator operator. Far from plunging over the windswept railing into the churning Atlantic, the precocious jerk had been playing elevator operator for almost an hour, transporting guests to the decks of their choosing. He had captured the hearts of many when they realized that he understood the numbers on the control panel and could indeed take them up and down the shaft at will. Not one adult seemed to think it odd that the toddler was alone and operating an ocean liner's elevator as they came and went. Almost on cue, my parents suddenly appeared, positively ebullient with the joy and pleasures of a delightful afternoon cavorting with the Greek captain. They asked us both how things had been going. Considering retirement in the Sunshine State? Better read Chapter 41 first. It's up next and called Unwelcome Guests Blow In.